Zelda. I've been a Zelda fan ever since I first played Twilight Princess at around 10-ish years old, I want to say. After Skyward Sword killed my interest, Breath of the Wild managed to re-spark said interest in the franchise. And that spark has yet to die out again. Since Breath of the Wild, I've played a lot of other Zelda games like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Zelda 1 and 2, A Link to the Past, Hyrule Warriors, The Link's Awakening remake, Wind Waker, and I even revisited Skyward Sword when it came to the Switch, and it was a pretty good time in my book. A lot of these games are good in my book, to be honest, aside from Zelda 2. However, since I've now played a ton of Zelda games in comparison to that 10-year-old boy who picked up his first Zelda game and started herding goats, as Wolf Link, its biggest reoccurring issue has started to become much more apparent. There is but one Zelda character that holds the series back for me, and it isn't Navi, nor is it Fi or any of the lacking companion characters. And no, it's not the antagonist of Age of Calamity whose name I forgot because he's such a generic and unmemorable bad guy. It is without a doubt in my mind none other than... Oh boy. Hear me out on this. Ever since Zelda's inception on the NES, Link has been the protagonist of every Zelda game, and being the hero of this series that has evolved in style, gameplay, and tone over 30 years and going, you'd expect Link to also grow and evolve. Well, yes, that happens, but at the same time, not really. To put it simply, Link is not a character, but a stand-in for us, the player. It just doesn't work for me. I just can't put myself in the shoes of a character like Link. This dude is a sword-wielding hero of legend who travels across land, sea, and the sky, fighting weird monsters and even weirder bosses, and you expect me to relate to this dude? I think I've made it clear that I play Zelda to explore the grandeur world that lies in each game. Okay, so I realized I didn't actually say anything about liking Zelda for its gameplay, but, Zelda's fun. I don't know what to say. So why do I care about the portrayal or lack thereof concerning this one character? Well, maybe it'll help if I go through my thoughts on each Zelda game I've played and how they use and not use Link to varying degrees of quality. I'm gonna skip Zelda 1 and 2 because both are more game than they are story, and it's a little silly to ask so much from an NES game of all things. I also forgot to mention that I'm not gonna talk about A Link to the Past. I doubt it does anything with Link, but I soft-locked myself at a certain part of the game, so I can't really progress even if I wanted to, so... Ocarina of Time is a very odd one. For a game that heavily focuses its narrative on growing up and suddenly becoming an adult sacrificing their own childlike innocence to carry the heavy-handed responsibility of saving the world from damnation, you'd expect our standing character to reflect this narrative, right? Other than the idle animations and these brief glimpses of childlike innocence, you could replace Link with a brick, give him a funny cap and overalls, and he wouldn't feel out of place at all. The biggest flaw with this game is that it relies on you making a connection with the 7 sages for its story to really work. The problem is that I don't really get attached to fictional characters all too often. I'd rather watch another fictional character make these connections themselves, which is way more interesting to me than the former. Unfortunately, that's where the narrative leans more towards. For a title that came out in the late 90s, its gameplay has aged surprisingly well. Mostly. I just wish that Link was more of a three-dimensional character, much like his janky 3D model. I was originally gonna put Majora's Mask into its own category, but I soon realized that it shares the same aspects that could either make or break its narrative. What sets it aside from the last game is that its characters are actually enough to get me invested. But it's still a little disappointing how Link is much more sidelined here. He has much less plot relevance here than in Ocarina of Time, but considering the conditions that this game was made in, I could give Majora's Mask a pass because of this. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess also have glaring similarities with the way they use the green hero. Both start out in a quiet community disconnected from the rest of the world, but a call to action when the peace has been disturbed by outside forces, where they explore the wide open world while bringing peace wherever they go. And there's also a wacky side character guiding his way, almost forgot to mention that. What really sets these games apart from the last two is that they tried to give Link more of a personality. Kinda. One is very cartoony and bright, much like the game's setting, while the other is very soft and tranquil. Again, much like the game's setting. Twilight Princess spends much more time setting up motivation to drive Twilight Link into battle, and even more time setting up the dynamic between him and the companion character. Where Wind Waker didn't do enough to set up its motivation for Wind Link, and didn't bother to do anything with its companion character. Despite one shining in one area that the other doesn't, they both have the same flaw. They both dispose of this motivation too quickly. By the halfway point of each game, he has already saved the people he cares about the most, so He just reverts back to the blank slate archetype of the previous Zelda games. There's a lot happening gameplay-wise, but same can't be said about the story progression or Link. Though I can imagine that Twilight Link has grown close to Midna to the point where he wants to help achieve her goals. I can't imagine Wind Link ever wanting to stick around with the King of Red Lions or Tetra to the very end of the game. There should have been a much stronger connection between Link, the previous King of Hyrule, and Zelda. Restricting one as a boat that can't travel on land and the other inside a sealed off room is not my idea of a strong connection. What's important to take away from these games is that it's possible to give Link some kind of a personality without giving him a full-on voice. Come on! What the f- Skyward Sword takes another step forward, and addresses the biggest flaw I had with the last two games. It sets up Link's motivation and never lets go of it until the climax of the game. Here, Link and Zelda have a very awkward and romantic dynamic, but this romance is halted when Zelda is pulled down to the surface, driving Link into action. The whole game is him trying to find and save his childhood friend from the deviously flamboyant Girahim, who just wants to use the reincarnation of the goddess Hylia to reawaken his sealed master. And you can clearly see the pain, happiness, anger, and frustration on Link's face throughout this adventure. But despite Skyward Sword's very different direction with its much more involved story, it's still stuck within the conventions of the franchise, and it is no more apparent than with Link. He's still treated as this bridge between the game and the player, but at the same time, it's clear that he's trying to be so much more than all the other Links we've discussed so far. There are moments where we clearly see Link speaking actual sentences to Zelda's father and Groose, but we can't hear it for some reason. And then there are all these instances where we, the player, are given the power to choose what Link can say at these specific moments. This weird in-between of him freely speaking and us choosing what he says makes it feel like this game can't decide on what this Link is allowed to be. If they had just let him be a character that can have an actual dynamic with the people around him, then Skyward Sword would not have felt like it was stuck in the past while trying to build a new and unforeseen future for the franchise. And 7 years later, we'd get just that. After so many years and a few delays, Breath of the Wild was brought into this world and changed what was expected from Zelda. Hyrule was the biggest it had ever been. The gameplay loop was simple but insanely addictive. Almost everything changed with this new direction Breath of the Wild was spearheading. At a side glance, it looks like another case of the same old when it comes to Link. But it's actually a much more interesting way of acknowledging his usual silence that often goes unnoticed in each game's respective world. Although you do have to track down multiple sources in order to get the full narrative, both in-game and beyond, that being the Creating a Champion book. This fact alone makes it the second worst aspect about this game's narrative, but I'll elaborate on that later. For now, let's look at what we have to work with. These diaries, owned by the champions, contain a little bit of Link's pre-Calamity days. The most significant entry comes from Mipher, where she entails meeting Link when he was only 4 years of age. Born from a line of knights, his swordplay skill at that age was already exceptional, which also gets a small mention in Revali's diary. It goes to show just how gifted this iteration of Link truly is, compared to all the others that came before, only emphasized more in Creating a Champion, where it states that Link was around 12 or 13 years old when he pulled out the Master Sword, years before the Calamity would take place. This is all done to contrast with Zelda's struggle. Even after everything she's tried, her sealing powers just won't awaken. I can't help but imagine that others in Hyrule must have made constant comparisons between her and Link, which would likely be the root of her boiling jealousy, which didn't get any better after the king made him her appointed knight years later. Zelda is very cold towards Link at first, but over the course of the flashbacks, we see the two grow much closer. And in her diary, it states that she even got Link to open up about his routine silence. Fast forward to Ganon awakening, Zelda awakening her powers, Link is dead, and 100 years later he forgot to bring all that character with him out of the Shrine of Resurrection. Given the fact that he literally went through a complete memory wipe, it would have been cool to have him act like, let's say, Goku. But over the course of the game, he'll gradually step back into his silent demeanor seen in the flashbacks. But that doesn't happen. This would be the part where I point out how Link freely speaks in-game, yet he stays silent in all the important cutscenes, but I already talked about Skyward Sword, so I'd be repeating myself. Except Breath of the Wild has it the worst in this department because all the other characters actually have voiced dialogue. Out of all the things to carry over from the last game, why did it have to be this? Oh, whatever, we still got one more game to go through. In Majora's Mask-styled Zelda sequel fashion, Link has absolutely no plot relevance in the story. Yay. I mean, he does have a cool arm though, which he loses at the end. Okay, I'm just gonna talk about that quick. Why did Link have to have his boring-ass right-ass arm restored? What was wrong with the one Raru gave him? Does Nintendo have more plans for Breath of the Wild Hyrule? I really hope not. Don't get me wrong, I had a blast playing Tears of the Kingdom when it came out, but I am genuinely done with this iteration of Hyrule now. I don't even know which one of these games I like more. They just blend in with each other. Except one is just slightly newer. Link is a very weird example of a silent protagonist in any game I've played. He's a character that started life as, well, what I just said, but over the years has tried time and time again to break out of this role in more ways than one, and hardly anything has ever come out of this. This isn't something I've ever lost sleep thinking about, if I'm being honest. As I sorta mentioned at the start, I play Zelda for the gameplay and to explore its world, so Link serving the simple role of the player stand-in doesn't really bother me. But if I'm ever asked who the worst character is in Zelda, he'll likely be my first answer. I just thought this was a pretty interesting topic that isn't discussed as much as all the others, at least on YouTube. And even if I wanted Link to be more of a protagonist than a stand-in, I'll just go and read the many manga adaptations by Akira Himikawa. For real though, go read Twilight Princess, it's really good.